Destiny, Guardians, gamers, and wow, the glitching is a real thing. We're on a tier 2 containment here. Magnetize, magnetize. Anyway, um, so recently, everyone's talking about the new full teaser. Not really a teaser now, an actual official trailer, practically. I mean, really a genuine preview for a change. Anyway, for the Rings of Power, and I have some mixed expectations. I won't say opinions yet because I have not really actually looked at the trailers in extensive formats or things like that. You know what I'm talking about. I've listened to some reviewers, some critics, some critical thinkers, and such, and it's kind of the Rings of Power is going to be one of those polarizing events. I think, looking at the meta of the brand and the franchise. Um, there's a couple of points that were brought up amongst the different channels that I observed. I don't really necessarily follow them because I'm not watching all their content, just the stuff that is more or less of informational relevance to myself. In any case, I wasn't aware that that Tolkien's son had passed away, and that the project for the Rings of Power didn't come to be until after that happened. And I was like, oh, well, that does seem kind of, suspicious, and, to catch the family at a moment of weakness, to sell the license to what is eventually an appendices to the greater works of the Lord of the Rings and, and the Hobbit. The Silmarillion is a gazetteer. It's more of a resource work than my observations and experiences with it. I own a copy from ages past. It's a softbound book that's like totally destroyed. My eldest read through it, and when she handed it to me, she was like, "Dad, be warned, it's very dry." And I'm like, I can imagine it is. And there are a couple of channels that go into deep lore on the Silmarillion, and I'm like, this is kind of fun. The thing with me about books versus film or television or any other form is that I hold the book canon in a very I won't say sacred, but a very pure place in my mind and in my experience. The book canon is almost always standalone. I try to keep the film and the book and the comic book canon separate from each other, because each interpretation from the book, typically it's the book that comes first. The first works, I'll just call them that. Typically the canon of the first work is the grounding foundation of what's going to come afterwards. People are going to fan fiction, and then that fan fiction is going to be more polished and more refined, and then eventually it'll end up being an interpretation. And that's all fan fiction really is just a very indulgent interpretation of the world and characters and events in the first work. And I'm totally cool with that, honestly. I mean, I am myself at many times have done fan fictions of of my very most favorite brands and intellectual properties. But I've done the fan fictions in the way, in the terms of role-playing games, like Dungeons and Dragons. Like there was a movie that came out some years after I got into D&D called Excalibur, and I can't give you details of directors or actors or anything like that. All I know is that cinematically stunning telling of the Arthurian mythos. Not all the acting was, top notch. It had a really campy kind of, shucks golly feel to it, and I think that was kind of the point. Is like, when you make choices on what you take with you into the film or into the reimagining or interpretation of your efforts, of the effort before you, what you take in there is really what's going to be best served by by what you're trying to accomplish. What are you trying to do? Are you just trying to introduce people to this lore? Are you trying to bring up some kind of point that's not openly discussed on in the canon or in the environment or in the settings or characters. Like for instance, you have the character of Lancelot, you know, who is basically a French author self-insert from the original tellings of the Arthurian mythos. Um, and it's you know it's again it you know there's complication when it comes to that because Lancelot is a fanfic. He is a fan fiction creation. Um, and this is, you know, but he's become such an ingrained part of the telling of the Arthurian mythos that most people, even scholars, true scholars, will go ahead and accept him as a relevant character because, like any legends and mythologies, you know, a living legend or a living mythology is one that continues to grow and evolve, and it's got a relevance in its own self that you need to understand why this is being told and how it's being told. For instance, we have a myth or a legend about George Washington, our first president of the United States of America, where he was like, "I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree." When in fact, historians have actually proven that this is hyperbole. This is complete fabrication. It's a summary of his character and an example of his choices and what he valued in his administration of our country and in the leading of it through its rebellion against the imperial crown of England. uh, George Lucas. In any case, and so I mean, for a lot of times, a lot of us grew up as kids, accepting that little exchange, that little event as actual fact, as it did actually happen, and learning later on in life that hey, this was all kind of just an amalgamation of various different events, and then simplified and distilled into a more consumable experience. And I think that's really what it comes down to when you get interpretations of first works. You're getting something that has definitely been retooled for consumption. That is meant to be a product or service that you're going to pay into and support through financial efforts or resources or whatever. Um, so there's a lot that can be criticized about it, and I think what really comes down to it is the the channels that are or the sources that are openly bashing, you know, the Rings of Power and criticizing it. I would say really roughly. They're missing the point. It's not about whether or not we introduce some new cultures or some new characters. It's not whether or not we introduce or reimagine a particular event that is fluid enough in its source that it doesn't really make much of an impact how you imagine it. For instance, if we think of let's take an example here. Um, I have not read all of the Silmarillion, by the way. It is very dry. I was like, oh my lords, this is boring as fuck. Seriously, I'm just going to be blunt about that. But let's take an example. Okay, say for instance you have a story of a hero uh, who was um, who was a maker of a sword, and that sword granted the hero near godlike powers, but there was always something holding them back. And let's say that hero has a big showdown with their master, their mentor, their teacher. And in the showdown, the teacher is killed by the hero, and then but the teacher is somehow able to meld their personality with the sword, and through the sword, continually teach the hero until that hero now becomes the true hero that they were always meant to be. Um, and then through the course of the adventures that the hero has with the teacher sword, they reconcile their differences, and they learn that that teacher and student should always be that having a teacher in your past is important is just as important as having that teacher in your present. that when you finally do grow beyond that teacher and you no longer, the lessons that teacher can teach can bring to you are no longer, um, being helpful, then it's time to find a new teacher. Let's say there's a scene where the sword breaks, and the hero, of course, at first is despondent, but then the final words of their original teacher is, hey, this was always meant to be, and you have learned as much as you can from me, and now it's time for you to find a new teacher. And there's like, so who broke the sword? In the original works, the first tellings, it's the hero in a rage breaks the sword against. I would have thought I was going to get a pattern. It's a bummer. Breaks the sword against an unbreakable armored foe, and it was because the hero was enraged that the sword shattered. Um, and this is kind of what is um, this is kind of what happens in one of the tellings of the Arthurian mythos, that in their duel to uh, to get over the bridge, Lancelot and Arthur have a fight on the bridge, and Arthur breaks Excalibur over Lancelot, essentially, and then has to take the sword to the lake, and the Lady of the Lake repairs it. But I mean, you can interpret that in so many different ways, and you can respin that in so many different ways. Maybe the duel wasn't against Lancelot when Excalibur was broken, but the duel was against some other Dark Knight, and Arthur, in his efforts to outdo Lancelot in the conflict, calls upon the power of the sword, and in his hubris and vanity and pride, breaks Excalibur. They win the fight, but the sword is broken. The takeaway is still the same. Arthur loses control of his humility and all the things that make him a kingly person, and falls into barbarism like his father before him, uh, and breaks Excalibur, which is the promise of a unified England. And that is something that you can interpret and reimagine and spin pretty much all the ways you want. It doesn't really change too much contextually, so long as Arthur, in his vanity and pride to outdo Lancelot, breaks Excalibur by foregoing all of his kingly features, and then learns the lesson that regardless of who challenges you or who's better than you must always be true to those standards that you have held yourself to all the time before. And if there is something you can learn in the experience, you must also try to remember that wisdom. And like I said, I fucked up. Um, I've only actually beaten this person one other time, and it was with a sword. So we're gonna go sword. Oh, yeah. And again, like I said, there's a lot to be taken away from the Rings of Power. I think that regardless of what the hypercritics and hyperfans are going to say, you're going to want to, if you're interested in watching it, then, by all means, don't deny yourself or don't be swayed by the opinions. There is a key message in one of the scenes where Elrond talks to Galadriel about, the past needs to go away, you can put your sword down kind of situation. And, and of course, Galadriel is, concerned about a new shadow rising in Middle Earth. Now, of course, we all know who that new shadow is. It's still no patterns. Um, that's actually not a bad roll. I might keep this roll. Nah, pass. I have so much deep sight resonance, and I have nothing to build with it. This is terrible. Um, so yeah, and in one of the channels I watched, there was a correlation about killing the past, and a reference to another brand that very very pointedly wanted to put out there that the past has to die, let the past die, kill it if you have to, blah blah blah. But you can go look it up. You'll understand. You'll see what I'm referencing. Um, and I don't think that's really the case. I don't think the past technically needs to die. I don't think that we should, that we should kill it if we have to, because wisdom comes from the past. What we learn from our past is what we call wisdom, and if you don't have wisdom, you truly can be, dominated in the most subtlest of ways, and it'll be very long before you realize, hey, I didn't need to give up so much of my independence. I didn't need to surrender so much of my personal values or anything else. And I should have been, I should always be aware of the fact that, there's always going to be a threat. And threats do most times come from the past because the people of the past don't want to give up their power. And, you need to be apprised of the efforts that they're doing all the time because it's always going to be there. So with Elrond, going off in this one scene in the trailer, which I am going to go fully watch after I'm done chit chatting here with you guys. Um, they pointed out about him going on about it's going down. Everything is fine. The country is fine. It comes back, to Elrond later in the Lord of the Rings itself that no, that nothing was fine. That a Dark Lord did rise. Sauron did return. Morgoth's apprentice or lackey or whatever you want to call him, uh, was continuing the dark work, and that's kind of the way the whole thing goes. Um, the reason why, oh come on, that was bullshit. You didn't need to do that. Fucking snag me with the stupid slow rocket. Um, the whole point behind Tolkien's efforts with his writings was he drew upon his experiences as a soldier. He drew upon his experiences as a teacher. He drew upon his experiences as a parent and, a sibling and, you know, no author, no writer worth their efforts sits in a vacuum. You know, Tolkien, Tolkien was a person of the outside world and very deeply interested in cultures, especially through language. And, whereas I would investigate a culture through its arts and its games, Tolkien was enamored with cultures through their languages and customs. And this is what you see in The Lord of the Rings. And so the only thing that I am going to say at this point and wrap this up is that if the Rings of Power come back to those themes of language and culture and customs, and it's in the struggle of good versus evil. Uh, if they represent the point and meaning of the first song and the second song and all that, and the relevancy of how evil finds its roots in the simplest of beginnings or in the simplest of ideas, and that not I don't know. I'm gonna be very, very open about what's being said, and understand that this the Rings of Power is basically going to be a fan interpretation because I mean you got to be a fan of something before you want to do something with it. If I wasn't a fan of robots and machine intelligence and all that kind of stuff and that turn towards technology, I wouldn't be enjoying you know what I do. I wouldn't want to write stories about robots. I wouldn't want to write stories about you know uh, the meanings of existence and the meanings of you know of meaning. What's the value of having meaning? What's the value of pursuing a dream? Um, and writing that through the lens of machine intelligence, of a created intelligence. I mean, it's like everything human. It's complicated. So I'm going to go at the Rings of Power as a fan interpretation of what was in the Silmarillion, and as long as I would say, as long as the texture and the as long as the feel of Middle Earth is there, uh, as long as the textures are there, as long as the notes are there, as long as the DNA for the short term is there, I'm not going to say it's a good or bad thing. I'm just going to say this. This is an effort on its own, whether it was Lord of the Rings or not. It has to be a good story. That's basically all there is to it. I want to feel good for the good guys, and I want to feel pity for the bad guys, and um, I want to feel justification when the evil guys are finally, taken down and stuff like that. Well, I don't know what the plan is for the series if they're going to go for more than one season. And that's the other thing too is that everybody talks about in cinema recently about letting the past go, kill it if you have to, kind of shit, and yet they're sitting here and they're just leeching out these brands season after season, movie after movie. It's like, well, you guys are just hypocrites then, aren't you? Why don't you just go ahead and let it go? And that is weird because I think I had a dream about that someone said you're a hypocrite. Oh man, what is that? What's that about? Bullshit. I don't think this is a good idea. But hey, it happened. Oh wow, you're still around. Why are you still around? Oh, no goodies? Well, no, we're just doing this for the goodies. Anyway, so yeah. I just read. I just went off way longer than I intended to. Let's go ahead and pop this. I don't know what my reward was. Experience. Ghostface Rings, I guess. Whatever. Yeah. Thanks for stopping by. Give Rings of Power a chance, is all I'm going to suggest. Um, and if you're going to listen to any critical reviews, try to balance them against the fervor of the supporters versus the skepticisms of the critics. It's always good to have the information from all sides before you make your own decision, and then purge all that shit. Sit down, grab whatever movie snack you enjoy, and let yourself go for that first hour or so, and see what happens. Thanks for stopping by.